Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And on today's episode, we have Catherine Yronwode, and I just want to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You came as a request from my friend Lee Hester. I don't know if you know who he
Oh,
is.
of course I know Lee
Yeah.
Hester. Shout out to Lee. Hi,
Yeah,
Lee.
so he's been saying you need to get Cat Ironwood on the show. You need to get, and I go, okay, okay, okay. I mean, I know of you, and I think I've probably emailed and texted you before for various questions for articles I've written in back issue and stuff like that. But
That's
I
right.
don't know if we've actually ever spoke till now. So
Mhm.
welcome.
Yeah.
So, I guess how I usually start off is kind of tell me a little bit about yourself, and I guess I guess did you want to get into comics, or how did you get into what you ultimately are known for? I'll say that.
Well, I grew up in a family of academics and librarians, publishers, and authors,
Mm.
and bankers too, although I was not part of that. And I was raised by my mother, who was a research librarian at the University of California, um, and then at UCLA. And I liked comics because I liked art, and I bought a Walt Disney's Donald Duck Vacation Parade, and I really liked it. And I was reading it at the library at UCLA. My mother worked there on Saturdays, but she didn't want to pay for a babysitter, and I was well behaved, so she brought me along, and it was okay with her boss, whose name was Wilbur Smith, and his boss, whose name was Lawrence Clark Powell, after whom the Powell Library was named. And I was reading this comic book, and my mother was embarrassed. She was an immigrant. She was a refugee from Germany,
Mhm.
and her English was rather poor. And she spoke many languages. And she was embarrassed. And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. My daughter's reading a comic book." And Wilbur said, "Oh no, comic books are popular culture." And then because he felt that now I was embarrassed, he turned to me and he said, "You have to keep that very well. Don't break the spine. And when you're done with it, you want to put it in some place to exclude light and keep it dry." And I said, "Like what?" And he goes, "Like this." And he brought me a manila envelope. And he said, "When you're done with this, put it in here, close it, don't lick it, just put it away and lay it flat." And he goes, "You'll want that later when you're an adult." And I went, "Okay." So then I had some Mad magazine. Actually, these were Mad comics,
Oh yeah.
and I read them, and I did the same thing. And after a while, Wilbur took an interest in this, and he said, "Oh, you have quite a collection of these, and you're keeping them all very well for posterity. Some library may want those at a later time." So I began to collect comics very conscientiously. And around that time, I first noticed that people signed comics. I didn't know that they had. I saw a comic book. It was a Mad, and it had a log on it, and in the log was carved the letters wood. And I was sick with the Asiatic flu. And my mother said, "What can I get you? You have to stay home from school. What can I get you?" And I said, "Bring me more comic books with wood in them." And she said, "What do you mean wood?" And I said, "Here, this." And she goes, "Oh, that must be his signature. That must be an artist named Wood." And she turned to the front, and of course it said Wallace Wood. And she said, "So I'll go and find you some more comics with art by Wallace Wood." And she found me a bunch of them, right? And so that was my first introduction, that there were named people that you could find out who they were. And I really became interested then in basically buying everything that Wally Wood had ever done.
Wow.
Um, when I finally met him, I was almost in tears, my childhood hero. And he was so sweet and almost in tears. He said, "I can't believe that you started following me at such a young age and really liked my stuff," because I'd always written about how important he was to me.
Mhm.
Um, and so we had a wonderful meeting eventually. So part of it was I just was interested in comics. And then later, I was interested in boys. And I noticed that more boys read comics than girls. And so there were also more boys rode bicycles than girls, but I have very poor vision and I couldn't ride bicycles. But more boys repaired automobiles. So I became interested in vintage car customization
Hmm.
and comic books because those were two places where I could hang out and be around boys and smell how good they smelled and they just were very attractive to me. It would be the equivalent of a boy deciding to take up embroidery, perhaps, just so
Yeah.
he could be around girls. Right?
Hmm.
And so eventually I had a huge collection of comics, and I then, sort of drifted away from that. I went in living into, I was very left wing politically, went to live in a commune and got into gardening. I was much into gardening and animal husbandry. But, and I got married and various things happened. And I mean, just a long story.
Hmm.
And that marriage broke up. And I was sitting there crying, and I thought, what did I do before I was married? And I thought, oh, comics. And of course, I had the whole box of these comics in these manila envelopes from before plastic, they were
Hmm.
all in their little manila envelopes. And I thought, I'm going to read comics again because it's something I did and I found a boyfriend, and this will lead me back to boyfriendhood. So I had a friend and I was telling him my plan. And he said, oh, so much has changed since you were last in comics. I was a letter hack and I would attend conventions and things like that, science fiction conventions that had comics as an outlier. And I stumbled upon, he showed me a more recent issue of Doctor Strange. And I thought, I'm going to write them again, just write a letter again. And I wrote, and it was printed. And weirdly, comic boys being comic boys, I got 3 proposals of marriage.
Wow.
And I thought, well, this is going to work, but not those guys, but this is going to work. I'll keep on letter hacking. And of course, I'm a writer. I was writing about, vintage farm machinery. I'm a writer, and I like to write nonfiction. And I was writing about how to repair your Singer sewing machine or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
Um, and I began writing more and more for comics, letter hacking. And eventually that led me to taking off and going to a Phil Sewling con. He paid me for me to write one of his program books. I had to interview everybody who was going to be there at the program. And I then of course, got to show up, and that just led to a career in comics fandom.
Hmm.
And then eventually I met Dean Mullaney, who with his brother had started Eclipse Comics, and they wanted me as a colorist and editor and typesetter. And
Hmm.
by that time, I was already working for a man named Ken Pierce, who's still around, by the way. You should
Hmm.
talk to him someday.
Okay.
Ken Pierce was publishing newspaper strip reprints, and I was working on those with a guy named Dennis McFarlane, and he was doing the paste ups, hot wax paste ups, and I was writing the intros for Ken Pierce. And it just led to an offer from Alan Light of the Buyer's Guide to write a column for the Buyer's Guide because I had my own typesetting machine and I could produce typeset copy. And so that turned into something called Fit to Print, which was a joke because the idea was to make it fit the space exactly, right?
Right.
And do my own paste up and everything. And then Dean Mullaney offered me a job at Eclipse, and I kept on working for Ken Pierce. And then um, I had wanted to interview Will Eisner. I really admired him. And I got Gary Groth at the Comics Journal to okay that he would actually print an interview with Will Eisner if I did it.
Hmm.
And so I went there and I interviewed Will, and Will and I hit it off, and his wife Anne and I became great friends. And at some point, he wanted me to come and catalog his material. So I
Hmm.
cataloged all of his art, and then I became his agent for selling his art, and also became in charge of numbering the pieces, the stories. There was no catalog. I created a catalog for them. And then I was hired by Dennis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink to oversee the reprinting of Spirit stories.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of, one thing led to another. And then Eclipse got bigger and bigger, and I was the editor there. Um, then that's what I did. And when Dean and I divorced, he fired me from Eclipse essentially, but I was still working for Claypool because Eclipse had been distributing Claypool.
I see.
And when Claypool went to online only, oh, and then I married. I've got to explain. Then I married somebody else named Nagashiba Yronwode, and I worked for Claypool. And when Claypool went to online only, we were let go. But in the meantime, I'd started my own publishing company and metaphysical store, Lucky Mojo Curio Company and Lucky Mojo Books. So there you go. And along the way, I got one other thing. In between, I also was a staff editor for Organic Gardening magazine during the period that after Eclipse went under and before Lucky Mojo got off the ground, because the then editor of Organic Gardening was a big fan of Marvel Comics and a friend of Stan Lee's, and he liked my fan writing, and he hired me to be a staff editor at Organic Gardening. And
Okay.
now I write in the area of folk magic and the popular culture and material culture of fortune telling. I've been doing that for about 25 years.
Wow. So I have so many questions based on all
Okay,
that.
well, that was it. Now you got
So
the whole resume.
yeah, I got the story, but I have questions based on what you said. So I guess the number one question I would have, and I'm going to jump around because you just said everything so nicely and chronologically, and I'm just going to ruin that. Okay, a lot of people. Well, I don't know about a lot of people. So, I'll say some people think you just kind of gave up on comics and just turned your back on it. Are you still a fan of comic books today, or you
Yes,
just like?
I am. But also, you have to remember another thing that I did. You don't have to remember it. I have to remember to mention it, which was trading cards.
Oh yeah.
Eclipse got into trading cards, and I've been a trading card collector, non-sport, well, sport and non-sport, but mostly non-sport, all my life. Cigarette cards and stuff like that. And I'm a typesetter, and I got into typesetting, neat typesetting, and so typesetting has always been, and book editing and book production has always been a part of my life as well as comics. So, for instance, when I worked for Claypool, I was typesetting their letter calls, and so for me, those two skills go hand in hand. Coloring, I was a very good colorist in comics, not particularly good letterer, although I'm actually an adequate letterer. I'm not a good drawer. And I don't like, and this is the big confession here, I don't like writing fiction. I like editing fiction. I like reading fiction, but I don't like writing it because once I create a character, I don't want to create a problem for them that might damage or hurt them. I'm too sentimental about characters. If I wrote comics, everyone would be in the pretty green meadows with the pretty flowers, and little Bambi deers would come to say hi, and the squirrels. It would be like, the scene where Snow White wakes up and it's all pretty
Yeah.
around her and all the little animals. I would write that endlessly.
No
That's
conflicts.
my story, right? I had a friend named Roger Slifer who wrote My Little Pony, and he said, "Yeah, I bet you could write My Little Pony." And I said, "I bet I could too, except you'd have to write the part where they had a problem." So I became very good at editing other people's writing.
Yeah.
And I'm also a very good reviewer. In other words, if someone brings me a story, I can suggest rearrangements and things like that. But I'm not a fiction writer. So with the idea of doing color and I love fancy show card lettering, I can just go off about lettering and typesetting. And I really got into labels. I collect label art, graphic label art of the late 19th and early 20th century, up to about World War II. Mostly chromolithographic from up to World War I. And so all of that stuff is what drew me to comics, because I loved the coloring system, the what used to be called the YRB system, and which is a simplified version of the CMYK color system. Anyway, all that stuff was what drew me to comics, in addition to, Superman saves the town. I mean, that I liked also.
Right.
But there was something else going on in comics that I didn't like, which became more and more of a reliance on weapons among the superheroes. And I may be simplifying by referring to Punisher, but when the Punisher came out, I really felt there was no place for me in editing that kind of material.
Mm.
And we were doing Airboy, and a guy named Chuck Dixon was a very good writer and was writing Airboy, but it became more and more about the guns and the violence.
Mhm.
And he was throwing out very highly charged political, you know, Soviets and communists and Nazis. And I'm like, this is not exactly, um, he would kind of equate communists and Nazis. It was just, eternal villain with bigger and bigger guns. And I really began to feel that, like at the end of Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai, when the guy brings the gun, the samurai have all these fabulous fighting skills and they have camaraderie and they have courage and they protect the peasants. And suddenly a gun is introduced
Mhm.
and this whole way of life comes tumbling down. And that's, I felt, happened with comics. And it was sometimes referred to as the new, grittier, more realistic comics.
Yeah.
And I realized I was not interested in um, comics about rape and do you know what I'm saying? It was like
Yeah.
it became a social environment that attracted fans who wanted to see more and more violence and attracted also writers and artists who wanted to draw more violence. Also, one other factor, do you know who Frank Zane is?
Hmm.
Okay.
Not sure on
Old
that name.
school, old school bodybuilder. He's still
Okay.
alive. Frank Zane was a bodybuilder who was very pre steroids, and he was just a weightlifter
Mhm.
type guy, very pretty, very well formed body. I found him very attractive. He modeled, or inadvertently modeled, his pictures were used by people to draw Tarzan. So
Uh,
he had the kind of Tarzan-ish body.
got it.
And I thought he was the height of female, excuse me, of male muscular achievement.
Mm.
When Arnold Schwarzenegger came along and steroids became more and more of a thing,
Yeah.
the male bodies that were, I have to explain here, I follow weightlifting, I follow wrestling, I follow those kinds of things, right?
Hmm.
And they became less and less human looking to me. Now, I ought to explain at this point, if you haven't figured out already, I am autistic. I'm a high functioning autistic person.
Hmm.
So for me, looking at people and seeing that it's a human and not just a figure against a background is sometimes a little difficult. And figuring out what people's emotions or faces are, that's why I really like comics, because the emotions were so
Hmm.
clearly drawn on their faces. And what I began to see were things that didn't please me. And these big, bulgy men, and I don't mean John Buscema bulgy. I don't mean, Buscema Conan. I mean, that's bulgy. That was getting to the Arnold Schwarzenegger era. That's okay. But it
Yeah.
became worse and worse and worse. And it soon began not to look like human figures anymore.
Right. Right. I know
And I'm
exactly
not
what
going
you
to
mean.
name
Yeah.
any names, but the
Yeah.
first name Rob may ring a bell with you. Okay.
Yes,
I
I know
mean,
what
I
you
don't
mean.
want to name anybody and put anybody down, but
Right.
there was a moment where I looked at that and I thought, is this a leg or is it a shape? You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
And I liked Kirby well, but I like Ditko more. If you're going
Mm.
to put me back in that era,
Yeah. Yeah.
because Ditko drew, well, he drew himself, and he drew that very slim baseball pitcher, swimmer physique. I liked that. Those kinds of characters no longer even featured in best-selling comics.
Right.
So no, I didn't turn my back on comics. Comics just simply stopped producing things that I wanted to pay my money for.
Yeah.
And when I no longer had a job, um, then I had to pay all my own money. I used to get review copies, and I
Yeah.
and I edited them. I could hire artists. I could say, "Hey, let's do this." I like people like Paul Galassi. I like people who drew Stranko. I like people who drew that kind of human body,
Right.
and the stories had a human dimension. I like Will Eisner because
Hmm.
he drew very human and humane stories. Um, I don't watch the comic book movies anymore, the so-called franchise movies, because they're very grim,
Yeah.
and I find them depressing.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that in my ideal world, um, heroes must always triumph at the end of the story. I'm not saying that. It's not that I'm a Pollyanna and want a children's book. I have read a lot of stories of loss, but I have gotten meaning out of them. But give me a Bill Sienkiewicz, someone who can actually draw anatomy, you know.
Right.
And so when that was devalued, a lot of my friends, especially in the left-leaning friends, went into undergrounds. But underground comics took another turn toward what I would call sexual misogyny and rape and
Hmm.
weird things like that that did not feel comfortable to me as a woman.
Hmm.
Women's comics were okay, but they were always holding up the banner for feminism, and I wasn't sure that wasn't what I wanted out of comics. I wanted
Yeah.
cool stories. So no, I didn't turn my back on comics, and I still do read comics, but I tend to read more um mm, that's kind of more introspective comics. I think one of the best comics I ever worked on was Zot by Scott McCloud,
Hmm. That was a
which
good one.
was an attempt to really show inner meaning as well as a beautiful art style. And I don't have any one art style. I mean, I've ranged all the way here from Sienkiewicz to Scott McCloud. That's quite a big difference right
Right.
there. Um, but I appreciate art for what it is.
Hmm.
But I feel that um, this is symptomatic of something much worse in society.
Yeah.
And um, the I mean, you don't want me to go all political on you, but right now, everything I was considered a freak or a weirdo in comics because I would talk about things like politics and the environment
Hmm.
and voters' rights and things like that. And they would people would say to me, "Shut up about that. We're into superheroes, right?"
Right.
So I find now that our entire country has become very uncomfortable for well-meaning, compassionate people to live in.
Hmm.
I've just become an um, old raging leftist Jewish grandmother.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I don't read as many comics as I used to. I mean, here's what I read now, and they're all reprints. One is the current issues of Mad. It's
Hmm.
99% reprint, and Looney Tunes, which is like 50 to 75% reprint,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's it. And
Well, yeah.
and
See,
years
and I,
ago, I'd have stacks, even in the 90s and the aughts, I would have
yeah,
stacks of comics. But, when everything became so superhero focused, I always like to say, oh, I don't like superhero comics. Well, that's not really true. I just don't like the way, like what you're saying is what they developed into. I
yeah.
can read, like today, even I was reading Ditko's Spider-Man because they're putting out those little Marvel Masterworks book
Hmm.
reprints. And a lot of those early issues I've never read before because they weren't in an affordable version. So
Hmm.
I'm reading them now, and enjoying them. And I said, why can't they just do comics like this now? But they said, well, at least they're reprinting them, so I'm reading these now. So
Right. Well, that's the thing. I read those all fresh off the stands,
yeah.
and they were very. Ditko Spider-Man was very meaningful to me. So was Doctor Strange,
Hmm.
because it went along with my interest in metaphysics and the occult, which was a whole nother parallel thing that I was interested in. And um, I guess I have to say I'm not trying to rag on comics. They became what they became.
Yeah.
Sales drive content.
Hmm.
And I found other things. I mean, I'm just as fascinated with vintage, you know, handkerchief print patterns. I know that sounds crazy. Fabric printing. I mean, I have many interests.
Yeah.
Comics really attracted me because of the coloring system, the limited color system.
Hmm.
And I was responsible, I guess I should say, partially responsible, but I'll take full credit for really popularizing another layer of color. In other words, instead of just the
Or
YRB,
yeah.
coming up with Y4, R4, B4. I know this sounds crazy, but that my little color charts meant something to people. And I really got into it because I was very concerned that Black people, which were a tritone color, were always either the same color of brown,
Right.
or if the ink lay on the press was wrong, they would come out with green skin.
Right.
And it would, because the yellow would be up too gained. And so I look at that sort of thing. So I thought, well, if we do this 70% color, which meant just more cutting of, I mean, like, we were really into it, but and printing on white paper. I wanted to make sure that various skin tones were accurately portrayed, and I also was very interested in sunsets and color scales, like in the old Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff, which
Hmm.
were airbrushed. And when computer coloring came in, I embraced it 100%.
Hmm.
And I'm completely agog at the beauty of computer coloring. They're able to do the most amazing effects. The problem is the underlying art often is just these bulging sausages of matter, protoplasm. They don't look like people.
Right, right.
So, yeah. And when you go back to the beauty of Disney coloring, for instance, I'm a fan of old animation as well.
Hmm.
And so I really have to say, what you're talking about is the kind of stuff that I still enjoy, and not because it's childish and safe, but because it's clever and
Right.
funny and
Hmm.
it's pretty.
Yeah.
It's prettiness is a big factor in comics, and one person's prettiness is not the same as another's. And maybe if I think something is pretty, you're going to think, oh, well, she's just, very narrow-minded. She has limited taste. So it is. I like acoustic blues music,
Hmm.
and I like acoustic string band music, and
Hmm.
I'm not a big fan of heavy metal. So what?
Hmm.
You know, I don't sit around and weep and piss and moan because Charlie Poole and the North Carolina Ramblers, who are dead, don't have a #1 hit. I just go and listen to them anytime I want
Right.
to. And
Yeah.
that's the thing, you mentioned reprints.
Yeah.
That's one of the wonders of the digital age, is that we can have everything we ever wanted now.
Yeah.
That's good.
And we have the computer where we can order it off in a second,
That's right.
we don't have
That's
to
right.
search for it. Some
That's
people miss the thrill of the hunt. I do to a certain extent, but at the same time, it's like it's nice to just say, "Oh, I want to get this book. Oh, there it is. Order done."
Yeah. I have found out that there's a place called Pick Click. Have you ever been to Pick Click?
Yeah, yeah,
I still get the thrill of the hunt from Pick Click, whereas I don't from eBay, because it's just sort of yes or no at eBay. But at Pick Click, it just gives you thousands of variations on
yeah,
your query, because
yep.
it has a very wide query that it does on your behalf.
Hmm.
But see, I also, again, I'm atypical. I collect restaurant ware with logos on it, script logos, restaurant ware from the teens, 20s. I have more cupboards of restaurant ware than I probably should admit to having. And just for the script and the colors. So
Yeah,
I get my dopamine hits from a variety of
yeah.
visual input.
Well, I'm with you. I don't just I don't know if you know anything about me, but I'm a writer as well. I've written,
Yeah, I do. I
but I
do.
go all over the map. I do animation, music, TV, movies, and
Yeah.
as far as my collecting tastes, I have things like I like old theme park travel brochures and
Oh,
maps and
yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
I have a whole file of that. Nobody knows that because I don't talk about it. But
That's
you know,
wonderful.
but I'm with you as far as I keep it because of how it looks. I like how certain packaging looks. I have books about cereal boxes and books about
Yeah.
toys, because it
Yeah.
shows like how they used to market and package these things to attract the eye and stuff like that. And a lot of these things they don't do anymore for whatever
Yeah.
reason. If it's considered old hat, I don't know, but it's like it really attracts me because I go, hey, you could still do it that way. It's just
Yeah.
they don't.
Well, I put out a line of books on folk magic, and
Hmm.
our covers are very much vintage retro, including art, public domain art that we pick up from the past,
Hmm.
and we color them with very clean comic book colors.
Hmm.
And I also design labels for these 200 and some products that we make in our shop. And I've hired comic book artists to work on our labels and on our covers as well. And that's kind of a trip. But I collect old catalogs just for the catalog art. I just
Yeah,
love it.
I've done that.
And so I found that I could separate my love of art from my love of narrative.
Hmm.
And that's sort of interesting, because as a child they were bound up together in comic books,
Right.
and I didn't, I mean, I would read stories with no illustrations. I read Nancy Drew, for instance. That
Mhm.
was all narrative. If you were lucky, you got the dust wrapper, you got one picture, right?
Yeah,
And that
right.
was it. Plus the inside silhouette on the inside cover.
Mhm.
And so I can follow narrative and enjoy narrative a great deal, but I really love art. And
Yeah.
I collected a lot of illustrated children's books around the same time as I began to seriously collect comics.
Mhm.
So those go back to the teens and 20s, a lot of chromolitho
Yeah.
elements.
I'm actually collecting more of those now, old children's books, because I don't buy new comics anymore. So,
Yeah.
um, and there's certain artists, children's books wise, I'll just name a couple, Dr. Seuss or
Hmm.
Richard Scarry or
Oh, I love
yeah,
Richard Scarry. Yeah.
going back
Oh,
for
that's so good.
Jean de Brunhoff, the Babar
Yeah.
books and
Oh,
things like
the
that,
Barbara
and
books. Yeah.
Laurent, his son. And it's like, I used to read them all as a kid, but I never owned them because, they're in the library, I can always check them out or whatever. They're always,
Hmm.
now it's like they're sometimes harder to find, but also I just want to own them so I can like pour over the pictures. So
Yeah. Well, I learned about collecting. My mother, as I mentioned, was a librarian, but she was also a rare book dealer.
mhm,
And she made it very clear to me, if they belong to a library, you can have access to them, but you have no control. They may be deacquisitioned by the
right,
library and be sold for 50 cents a pound.
right.
You don't know what's going to happen. So if you want to build a collection, build your own
Yep.
with an idea toward contributing it somewhere. So when I was working for Eclipse, everything we did, including all of our internal office memos, correspondence, all of the production layers of, like photocopies of pencils, the lettering, overlays, everything was sent to Michigan State University Library.
Mm,
Every month we would put together a big box for them,
mhm,
and they have the entire Eclipse stuff there for
mhm,
researchers. So I felt really good about putting that in a library, and I've always had that sort of connection with Michigan State and also with Ohio State University Library. Meanwhile, I'm collecting uh, right now. I've gone off into this thing of collecting pamphlets about fortune telling
mm,
that date back from the 1890s onward. And my arbitrary cutoff date is always World War II or something about that, because the printing changes to
mm,
litho offset, and so it's interesting printing. Um, but I have a huge pile, a bookshelf after bookshelf, how to read palms, how to read tea leaves. And I put out bibliographies of them, but I'm hoping to interest some library. I know of no library that has a collection of um, antique pamphlets on fortune telling.
hmm.
And yet it's a part of our popular culture.
Yeah,
You know, it's,
interesting.
and I think it's, for me, has always also been about reproducibility and popular culture. My mother, took me around to all the great, museums and cathedrals of Europe, and we would look at the Tiepolo, or we would look at the Mantegna, or whatever it is we're looking at, but there's only one copy.
Hmm,
And the art books of that time period, the 1950s, the copies were not well reproduced. And in some cases, the pictures themselves that they were photographing had been marred by grime and smoke over the years, and they hadn't been cleaned. And so I would look at the real thing and I'd say, well, no, this is better. So then I began to think about collecting mass produced art.
hmm,
And I think Maxfield Parrish was one of my first ventures into. Maxwell Parrish made these pieces of art, and they were by the hundred. And there's a guy named Harry Roseland who did paintings of fortune tellers,
hmm,
and African American fortune tellers, no less. And
mhm,
at a time when that was like 1901 and 1906, that was a very odd thing for him to be painting. He was a genre painter, but these were then reproduced on calendars and postcards. And of course, the oil paintings still exist, but they were made for reproduction. And so the idea of mass produced art, like at the restaurant ware with the beautiful lettering, or the trading cards, cigarette cards, and so forth, with the beautiful paintings of flowers, there's something about the mass production. And then, of course, the obsessive, and I know you'll know what I'm talking about, the obsessive upgrading,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, well, I just said the word obsessive upgrading. And I have a Patreon account,
Mhm.
and I offer my patrons, if they pay at a certain rate, a flat rate UPS postal service box filled with my cast-offs once I've upgraded. So they just sign on to they get postcards, they get books, they get whatever they're going to get. It's just the kick down, because I can't be bothered going to eBay and selling this stuff. It's pointless, you know.
Right.
But I am constantly upgrading and trying to have, near mint, the insane quest for near mint postcards of tea rooms in New Hampshire. Somebody once asked me, "What do you collect?" And I answered, "What don't I collect?"
I could almost say that, but I try to keep things in, a limited scope as best I can, but it's difficult sometimes, So
It is.
I always
Well,
say
I'm looking at you and here. I'm looking at what looks to be sort of a wooden craftsman style case,
oh,
and those might
oh,
be,
back there. Yeah,
yeah,
okay, yeah,
back behind you.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's that has my books in the case. It has some. Actually, those are Monkeys solo albums, believe it or not,
Oh, really?
above my shoulder. And then what else is back there? Oh, just photographs underneath the, uh,
Uh-huh.
and there's a
Yeah.
CD case way back there. I
Yeah.
still love
Yeah.
CDs. I love DVDs, and so,
Yeah. Oh, I
so
have. Do you know those life-size mummy cases they were selling for a while? Life-size repro mummy cases. They're 8 feet tall.
yeah.
You open them up and they hold DVDs.
Hmm.
My husband and I have 2 mummy cases, one female and one male, completely filled with vintage pre-code and early post-code Poverty Row DVDs.
Wow.
Because why? I don't know. Because I'm a train fanatic, and a lot of times for cheap location shooting, they'd shoot in a train yard. And I'm
Mm,
going, oh my God, there goes the daylight, or oh, it's the UP, and you could tell where they were filming.
mhm.
And so a lot of these films have rather low production values. But oh look, here comes Clayton Moore, but he's Lone Ranger, and he's punching somebody in the face, and there's always a reason to watch these old serials and old movies, but a lot of it is for location shots,
Mhm.
especially of Southern California, where I lived briefly for 3 years when I was a kid. Location shots of Los Angeles. Oh man, I'm just a fanatic about that. Architecture, retro and old architecture.
So my next question is, so when you got into comics where you were actually publishing them, and I assume was Eclipse the first you worked at, or was it Kitchen Sink?
Ken Pierce.
Ken Pierce, okay. But I guess it applies to every place. How did you come across the people that you eventually published? Were you meeting them at the
Hmm.
like the Phil Suling show, or people sent in submissions, or how did that work?
Ah, Ken Pierce did reprints.
Hmm.
So he was reprinting newspaper strips, but I happened to have had fandom connections with some of those people who were still alive.
Hmm.
And Ken made a very fundamental error. Well, I'll never let him forget it. Um, he, I'm going to laugh because he couldn't tell the difference between Klaus Nordling's art and Nick Cardy's art, for which he should be slapped with a wet noodle.
Wow.
And he put the wrong credits on them. Yeah, I know. I mean, I was like, what? So I sent him an enraged letter, and as he told me later, he saw this. He goes, "I got to get this woman off my back. I better hire her." And so he hired me, and that got me involved in outreach to older strip artists and trying to, getting permissions and stuff. He worked with the syndicates and stuff like that end of it, and I worked with the artists, and including getting them to write their memoir for a little introduction. So I started with that, and then when I was working for Alan Light, I began getting reviews, copies of DC and Marvel books, and doing interviews with people. And then I was doing interviews for the Comics Reader and for uh, the Comics Journal,
Okay.
and also for another fanzine called the Heroine Showcase, which was only about female characters. And I would write historical articles and stuff. But I also, in order to do that, I'd call up and interview people and say, like Alex Toth or whatever, and say, well, tell me what you did in that or the
Hmm.
other. And so I became friends with some of those people. And I realized, they were freelancers, most of them, and they, always needed a job. When I got together with Kitchen Sink, he was publishing underground comics, which,
Right.
as I said, they had a sort of a misogynistic outlook that I didn't find humorous. So, but I was involved only with The Spirit, which was he was publishing, and so um, I organized a spirit story in which was done as a round robin in which everyone did a page or two. All my friends that I knew
Okay, I
through
remember that.
fandom.
Yeah,
What?
Spirit was that called Spirit Jam? Is that what that
Spirit
was?
Jam. That's
Okay,
right.
thank you. Okay,
Yeah, and
I
I had
remember
the
that.
pleasure of being drawn by Brent Anderson, who drew me very prettily. um, and so I was, when I did that Suling Con program book, that was, sort of help people to get to know me. So when I got together with Eclipse, I basically brought, he had his friends in comics. He lived in New York. I mean, and I just sort of brought my friends along, and some of them, our friends were both of our friends. I mean, he was already publishing people that I knew when I joined his company with him and Jan. So it became sort of a thing of bringing in those people. But then there was another thing that I did, which I really liked doing, which was we would get all of these requests from people. They would send in samples of their art. Can you hire me?
Hmm.
And they usually did display poses. And many of them were good display poses, but there was no narrative. So I wrote a sample 5-page story, which was so generic that you could pretty much do anything you wanted with it. And that story I then carried around to the different conventions, to Dallas and Houston and Tulsa, Oklahoma and New York. And I'd hand out this assignment to them. If they showed me their art, I'd say, well, I critique it. This is nice. You handle the musculature nice. And often they were children, and their parents would be there, and I'd say, you know, um, Timmy is doing pretty well, but he's drawing with ballpoint pens on letter paper. Do you know that comics are produced on Bristol board? And I'd hold it up. I said, this is Bristol board. Would you like a sheet of it? And if they should draw a pencil first and then a pen. Here, let me give you a list of art supplies.
Hmm.
And then Timmy is pretty good and might want to get special art classes or maybe go to art school. But in any case, and then I would turn to Timmy. I said, but whatever your mother can provide for you, that's fine. But I'd like you to get your best friend who also likes to draw. And I want you each to get just leotard and tights, like you would have if you were a male ballet dancer. And I want you to have a nice light source, and I want you to draw each other. Just sit and draw
Huh.
each other over and over, draw from life. Don't just think that comic book artists have to memorize the insertion of the muscles. Of course, they memorize it, but they also have to look at life. And then these next year, I'd come back, and by then I'd say, here's a 5-page script. Now try to do a script. And this script had everything in it, from pirate ships to dogs, little old ladies, cops. It had everything. It had a 2-point perspective, 3-point perspective, where this person had to jump and fly, and all this stuff was in this one story. And and I'd say, now you draw this story and come back in a year when I'll be coming through this convention again. And I would hold court. And one other person really got good at this with me, who really enjoyed what I was doing, and that was Joe Kubert.
Hmm.
And Kubert and I talked about it. And then Mark Evanier kind of joined in, and he'd say, yeah.
Hmm.
He'd say, go see Cat. She'll tell you what you need to do. But he would be really good at critiquing their stories. So we formed whole panels where we would just sit there and bring in these young kids. And there's a point to this story, which is eventually they'd come back and you go, oh my God, you've grown up. You now are not 12 years old. You're now 19. This is totally professional work. You're ready for a backup at Marvel or DC. And then I would literally take their stuff and say, go find Dick Giordano or somebody, say, look at this person. Or I'd say, let me hire this person. We'll have you do a backup, because the next part of it isn't whether they can draw and do a narrative and leave spaces open for color and all the things that you need in comics. The
Hmm.
next thing is, can they meet a deadline? And if
Hmm.
they can't
Yeah.
meet a deadline, they'll never have a career.
Right.
Right. And so this gave rise to what I call Julie Schwartz's law. Julie Schwartz said this to me one day. He never meant it as a law, but I publicized it that way. And he always said, did I say that? And what he said was, to work in comics, you can be three things. You can be really, really good at what you do. You can be always on time, and you can be a hell of a nice guy. And you only have to be two of the three to get steady work in comics for the rest of your life. Okay.
I've heard
So
that
what
before, but I didn't know it was Julie who said. But
Julie said that, and I wrote it down, published it, and I called it Julie's Law. Next year, he came up to me at San Diego. He goes, what the hell is Julie's Law? Everybody's telling me that it's the smartest thing they've ever seen. So I now, when I interview people for any kind of thing that I'm doing with them, I have 3 radio buttons in my database: G, N, T. Good, nice, timely. And so that's Julie's Law. So I then began to cultivate these younger artists, but I knew that Eclipse didn't pay as much as DC or Marvel, and they were really wanting to draw Spider-Man. I would always ask them, what do you want to draw? And they would say, oh, I want to draw Batman or whatever. And you would then give them a story that brought out their Batman-like strengths, some architecture, some night scenes. And if they said, I really always, wanted to, draw Looney Tunes, you'd say, well, we'll do a little comedic backup, whatever it would be. And then I would say, now you have something you can show.
Yeah.
And they would then go on and get, and only one person ever screwed the fuck out of us, and I'm not going to name him. We've signed him up for a 6-part miniseries, and he did 3 parts, and he said, I've been hired from DC and I don't have time for you anymore.
Wow.
And I thought, should I find someone else to fill his shoes or just let it die? And I was angry enough. I let the series die, and I let everyone know why. Because that wasn't faithful and loyal of him.
Yeah.
He should have done, he could have slowed the pace down and said, listen, I'm working part-time for DC, and when I get the 6 done, well, I'll go full-time with DC. But no, he just dumped us. Wow. And he's not in comics anymore either, because he's not a hell of a nice guy.
Yeah.
And he's not timely. He's only very, very, very good at what he does.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, yeah. So, when you have very little money to play with, you have to make what you can, put yourself, don't fight the hierarchy. We were never a big company, but we were always somebody who brought people along. As a publisher now in the occult metaphysical field, I do the same thing. I do a series, I do 96-page books. It's a format I kind of got into with Ken Pierce, long story. He was doing 48-page books, because 48 pages is the smallest you can put a spine on, and most bookstores want a spine, but 96 is the smallest spine you can read the lettering on. So 96-page books on metaphysics and occult. And those people some people stay with me, but most of them will parlay either 1 or 2 books into a contract with a much bigger publisher. And in the case of metaphysics, it's a company called Llewellyn, or sometimes Wiser, Red Wheel. They go to them. They never come back to me, but I've started them and I feel good about it. And the only thing is, my contract with them is perpetual unless I let it go out of print. Right. And I keep the books in print, and I still pay them a royalty every time I reprint, and the royalty says 100% as if it was brand new each time we reprint. So I'm a fair dealer, but I know my role. So how do I bring those people in? I just look at their organizational skills, their timeliness to deadlines, and if they're nice. If they're not nice, why work with them?
Right.
So there you go. There's Julie's Law.
Cool. Now in Eclipse, a lot of the early things you brought in were from Pacific Comics. Did Eclipse buy them out, or did you just approach all the different people that were like
No,
Sergio?
It was an agent. That's a very good question, and not enough people have asked that over the years. Have you ever heard of a man named Mike Friedrich?
Yes.
He did what was called ground level comic. It wasn't an underground, but it wasn't a mainstream, and it was called Star Reach. Yeah. And Star Reach eventually stopped publishing, but he became a comic book agent. And he was an agent for artists, and he was an agent for brokering deals in the comics field. And he was a person I knew well. He was in the Bay Area, and so was I. And when Pacific Comics went out of business, he basically brokered what he could to DC and Marvel, but there wasn't much, and so they were not that interested. because they had their own character rosters, but we had all these variety comics and we had
Hmm.
the ability to do miniseries. So he came to us with books in various states of completion. So some of them were literally camera ready. Some of them were like ready to go on press, but the printer hadn't been paid the advance, right? Other ones were just penciled or just penciled and inked, or they were just a script. And so he brought us all of those, Mike Friedrich, and he was our broker, and we did a very good deal with him. I mean, the Shanis brothers were pleased because the artists got their stuff printed. We got some very good things. Some of those people stayed with us for a while, like they became to like us, but other ones went immediately on and considered it as a done contract and went on to another publisher because they're freelancers.
Yeah.
Freelancers know where the money is.
Yeah.
But that's how we got those characters. Then we
Okay.
found out later that there was another broker, a British broker named Des Skin,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and Des Skin had brokered the English stuff from Warrior to Mike Friedrich without telling Mike Friedrich that he actually didn't own the rights to Miracle Man, or Marvel
Mm.
Man as it was called. He actually was lying, and he was also trying to agent art, which he claimed that he had the rights to agent because he had um, uh, color negatives and color prints of these things that for reproduction that seemed to show that he was able to broker them, but he didn't. He was lying, and many people turned out never gotten paid. And Eclipse got a bad name because they said, well, Eclipse ripped me off. I never got my paycheck, but we had paid Des Skin. Friedrich brokered that deal between us and Des Skin, and Friedrich's reputation suffered as a result, as did Eclipse's, because Des Skin was a criminal.
Mm.
But there you go. That's that happens.
Yeah.
It was like there was something wrong with Des Skin's mind. I'm just going to say that he would do that to these artists in England, and of course, many of them didn't even know that we were printing their. These would be like color covers for like Tales of Terror, beautiful painted color covers. And one of them, what really tipped me to one of them looked like it was a cover for a hobby magazine. And I thought, this is a cover for a hobby magazine. And I said to Diskin, was this published in England as the cover for a hobby magazine? He goes, no, it's never been published. He goes,
Mm.
but you're right, it probably was done as a spec, painting for a hobby magazine. So I actually had to commission someone to write a story about a boy who does painting his little hobby things and they come to life and everything, and make it a terror story on top of it and a horror story. And while I'm doing all of this, I'm going, I swear this is a cover for, anyway, it turned out it was, and the guy never got paid by Des.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's a long, weird tale what happened with it. And the Shanos brothers were completely without fault, and Mike Friedrich was without fault. It was Des Skin who screwed some, but on some of the things he was not involved. He was only involved in the English stuff. So
Yeah.
the American things that came through Pacific, we simply bought those rights.
Hmm.
So that's why we did odd things like one issue of Gru.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I remember is getting
Mhm.
Gru. But I think you know, Sergio has always kind of shopped that around to different publishers
Of course
anyway.
he is,
So yeah.
because
Yeah.
he's his own character. I
Yeah.
mean, he's this,
Yeah.
right? That's very important. Creators' rights mean that you can do that,
Yeah.
and as a publisher, you must never become attached because you make a little money as a publisher. Why do publishers publish? It may be a kind of a feeling of it's collecting taken to a higher level.
Hmm.
Like, look, here's my things I've created through these other people that I've purchased their art. And so being a publisher, you do a lot of things out of passion and love. And that's what we did.
Now I should know this, but you can clarify. It'll just be easier to ask you. Okay, so Eclipse and Claypool.
Mhm.
Uh, were you part owner of both of those, or what's the difference on
Oh,
the?
no, no,
Okay.
no. Eclipse, I had shares of, and it was founded by Jan and Dean. And after I'd been working there for a while, I said, I think I should get some stock shares in this. And
Mm.
so I ended up with some stock shares. And when Dean and I divorced, he got those shares back. And in exchange, we made a swap, and I got that house that we had bought together and so forth.
Okay.
And so that was it was a fair trade. He
Yeah.
bankrupted the company later, but that was on him. I
Okay.
ended up with the house, which I barely was able to, I had to rent out rooms in order to make my mortgage at first until I got my next company started. As soon as I got my next company, Lucky Mojo going, I was able to pay off the house.
I see.
All right.
Okay.
So anyway, but to go back, the Claypool was Richard Howell and Ed Via. And Ed was a longtime fandom friend of Dean's, really close friend of Dean's, and a friend of mine to a lesser extent. Richard Howell was a really good fandom friend of mine and his late partner, Carol Kalish. And we just really liked each other. We knew each other and liked each other. When Carol died, it was just devastating. And Ed funded Claypool Comics, and Richard then found the talent. He got hooked up with Elvira, and he got Dan Spiegel. He got all of those people. That was all his doing, right? With Ed's publishing funding. And then they had no distribution. And so Eclipse didn't have a lot of distribution, but our distribution was better than nothing, right?
Yeah.
So Dean and Ed worked out a deal in which Eclipse became the distributor for Claypool. And that meant the Eclipse bug was put on them. And then I became involved in doing, typesetting and stuff and so forth. When Eclipse went under, I was very surprised and very pleased when I got a call, would you like to work for Claypool? Because I thought that was the end of my career in comics. But I went on to keep on working for Claypool, and the sales, of course, were lower. It was a more limited black and white line, but I kept on working for them until, as I said, eventually I met my husband, Nagasiva. He worked for them, and eventually they went to digital only, and they didn't need anybody like me or Nagasiva anymore.
Got it. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Because as a fan, when you just see these things, it seems like, the one company became the other company almost, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
like,
I know, but we always had the Claypool bug,
yeah,
the little logo, the Claypool
yeah,
logo and the Eclipse logo together. And you can see when then they stopped being together, and those
yeah.
just continue to be Claypool.
Got it.
And we just went on. And
Mhm.
I was very grateful that Richard Howell, felt that I was, because I was in a, pretty bad state of mind, losing a marriage and a business at the same time, right? And he
Yep.
said, no, no. But I never owned a share of Claypool. I was simply a freelance contractor
Got it.
person.
Got it. Then earlier in our conversation, you're mentioning you have an interest in animation. Have you written animation columns too? I seem to remember that, but maybe
No,
I'm not.
I've mentioned in passing, I've written about animation that impressed me a lot,
Okay.
but no, I've never been a formal writer on that particular topic,
Okay.
although God knows I could, but it's there's so many people who are so good at it that I
Okay.
love reading their findings and their correlations and things like that.
Okay. Because I was thinking, I guess I'm confusing you with somebody else, because I do remember your work, of course, in Comic Buyer's Guide and Comic Reader and Comics Journal and all the other stuff. So I said, was she in Mind Rot or Animania? I was thinking, yeah,
No,
yeah.
but
So
I
yeah.
remember once writing a long thing that ran for several episodes of about Flip the Frog.
Oh yeah.
I was like, I had my horror story, how my life was almost destroyed by Flip the Frog, and no, really, really, I'm not kidding. It made me realize that life was not worth living, and was a terribly dangerous place, and why were they showing this to me at such a young age? Anyway, whatever. But yeah, I know it sounds sort of weird in retrospect. It was a bad experience with Flip the Frog.
Oh
It probably was shown on television,
yeah.
in a cartoon cavalcade type show, and it was this particular. You can look it up sometime. It's called "Don't Play with Matches."
Oh, I know that.
Yeah. Okay. So imagine being 4.5 years old and watching that.
Yeah.
That
Well,
almost ruined me.
you'll be happy to know that Steve Stanchfield with his Thunderbeam company is putting out a digitally remastered complete Flip the Frog collection on
Oh my
Blu-ray.
God, I'll have to get it and see if I've grown up enough to be able to stand it.
It was supposed to come out like this spring, but I think it's been pushed back to this summer because he keeps getting, elements and upgrading it. It's supposed to be the most pristine Flip the Frog collection ever. So
Uh,
once it's ready to come out, I'm going to order one. It's just
well,
I'm kind of waiting.
it actually is something I would like because the horror of it. But that's the only animation I ever wrote extensively about.
Interesting. Okay.
And I got a lot of sympathetic letters from readers going, "Oh yeah, that scared the shit out of me." Yeah.
Well, I mean, some of those things can be jarring. I mean, I remember as a little kid, and me saying little kid, late 60s, early 70s,
Mhm.
um, they used to show awful colorized versions of Betty Boop and stuff like that.
I know
You
what
know,
you're talking
yeah,
about. Yeah.
but I didn't know they were awful colorized. I just knew that it was Betty Boop.
Hmm.
And that was the freakiest, weirdest shit I'd ever seen in my life. And I was like, what is this? But I'd watch it because they aired it like at Saturday mornings at 6:30 or something.
Yeah. See, now
Yeah.
I could stand out of the inkwell.
Yeah.
I could take it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I had to kind of, go into my stance and kind of grit myself because I'm going to be watching Under the Equal now, and it's going to be kind of freaky. But Flip the Frog, too much.
Now, Flip the Frog, I didn't know about till probably the late 70s. Is
Yeah.
I used to get the Black Hawk film catalog, and they'd
Oh
talk
yeah.
about it, and so I started learning things there. And then, of course, the key book for any animation fan is Leonard Maltin's Of Mice and Magic. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm good
Sure.
friends with Jerry Beck and everything. So it's like, it's like that's the book everybody where it all kind of made sense,
Yeah.
of it all. Because before you just say, oh, here's this character, and why is this made by this company, and why is this one by this company? I
I
don't.
know. It's like, why does it say wood on that log? That's when the light bulb goes
Yeah,
on and the kid wakes up and goes, "This is created, and I can play
yeah.
too." Right?
I have a
And
question for
I'm going
you
to say
based on
one
that
other
too.
thing about animation. I
Oh,
really got in as a kid. I really got into the Warner Brothers celebrity animation. You know what I mean? Where there would be these different,
oh,
Al
caricatures.
Jolson,
Yeah,
or
caricatures of the different.
caricatures.
Yeah, yeah,
And I became obsessed with trying to identify them. And as a child, with no access, there was no VHS, there was no replay. You had to have either caught that film somewhere in an art house, or on TV late night. And I'm trying to figure out who these people were, calling in my mother, and she didn't know because she was a refugee from Nazi Germany. What did she know? Like she's
yeah,
looking. It's a woman. It's a woman with sad eyes. I don't know who it is. It
yeah,
was supposed to be Greta Garbo or something.
yeah,
And so I'm calling all these American friends of mine, but who's that? And they'd say, oh, that's so and so. And so I began keeping these lists of who
yeah.
these people were. And then I wanted to find their movies. You
Right,
see,
right.
right?
Which now it's easier, but
Of course,
I,
back then it was like this. Back then, being a collector or a fan was this. You had to keep your own mental spreadsheet. You know what I mean?
right. I used to do that, but
Yeah,
my Google was my dad, who's still around. But,
yeah, yeah.
and I'd
Right,
say, "Who is this?" I mean, I'd know the obvious ones like Jack Benny or something, but
right,
it would be like, "I'm not having any fun," and then it's like, "Who is that?" And
right,
even
right.
my dad didn't know who that was, but it's Ned Sparks. Now that I know,
Of
of
course, it's
course,
Ned Sparks.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah. But
Like,
and
or
then
the other one that was always in the "You Want to Buy a Duck," and I'm like, what the fuck is this?
and then the other one I was going to say is the guy goes whoo, hoo, hoo, with his hands, and it's Hugh Herbert, but
Right, Hugh Herbert.
nobody, even my dad didn't know that one. He goes, "Oh, I used to see him in movies. I don't know." It's like,
Yeah, right. But see, that's such an interesting one. You mentioned that one because I ran across a Hugh Herbert movie and I went, "Oh, wait a minute, that's that guy,"
yeah,
right? But I had
exactly.
first seen it in one of
Yeah,
those cartoons. Yeah. So yeah, it was a whole deep dive into the pop culture of the previous generation, which I loved. I really loved it.
yeah. And it kind of surprises me, and well, I can't say it upsets me. It surprises me when uh like people will say, who's so and so, and it's like, who's John Wayne, is some young person. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
somebody that was for years iconic, regardless if you liked him or not. It's like he was
Mm-hmm.
just iconic. It's like it's gotten to the point, who's Elvis, who are the Beatles, who are, it's like, wow.
Yeah, my mother, bless her heart, used to
Uh,
belong to the Jane Austen Society
oh
because
yeah.
she couldn't stand people asking who was Jane Austen. But it's like a big time and pop culture is like a series of finer and finer meshed screens, right?
Yeah.
And so everything gets dumped in. It's a very coarse mesh. Everything comes through 10 years later, and then the next 10 years, the next. And by the time you've gone through 500 years of this,
Yeah.
only this very little powdery dust comes out and is labeled Shakespeare,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But who else? You don't know, right?
No.
It's the
I
same
mean,
with
there
the
could be another
artist.
Shakespeare, but we don't know who he is because he's forgotten. That's
Right, right. Oh, you could look at artists of the Renaissance or anything like that. It's always about time. And
right.
so if you're like at one of these levels of the screen, your personal interest goes back 100 years, let's say,
Yeah.
and but 120 years you don't know. But there are still people alive right now who are scholars who read, you know, Assyrian or whatever, and they're like, we recognize them as like, you know, rare ducks in the British Museum or something who can read Assyrian inscriptions. But imagine them walking around going, why can't everybody read Assyrian? It's so important.
I guess the surprising thing is it doesn't. This is showing our ages, I guess. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it is in a certain respect.
Yeah,
So,
it is that long ago. You
it's
know, they
like,
say that pop culture has a life cycle of 40 years.
yeah,
And for 40 years, the price builds and then it falls off because all the
yeah,
people who remember it and would have collected it have
yeah.
died.
And then you get fluky things like, I'll use Star Wars as an example. It's
Right.
like kids now watch Star Wars 1977 version like it's a brand new movie and it's 45 years old. And when I was a kid, that was new, and it had, you know I don't even know if I even saw any movie that was 45 years old. It would be some silent thing,
Yeah.
you
Well, yeah, I know what you're saying, and
Yeah,
I tend to collect things in runs, and that's so now you can do it.
yeah,
And Nagashiva and I are just recently, for the third time for me and the second time for him, going through all of the Zatoichi movies. These are these Japanese martial arts
oh
movies
yeah.
about a blind swordsman,
Hmm.
by this guy, Shintaro Katsu. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I've heard of them, yeah, and I
Well,
think I've seen a couple of them because
yeah, if you want to imagine a guy who, when young, looked like Elvis, but when old, looked like Curly of the Three Stooges. So true. You watch him through these movies. I mean, he just begins to look. He goes from Elvis to Curly, and
I
but
haven't
he
seen the curly ones apparently.
well, he
Yeah,
gets older and older, and he looks more
yeah,
and more like Curly. And he plays this blind swordsman, and they go through their, their opening, like, here's a random movie, and like, oh my God, it's a hit. We've got to make another one just like it, and we got to make a third one. Oh, now we've got to change the plot, and then it just becomes weirder and weirder and weirder, and eventually it's really weird. And I watch these things as runs,
hmm,
or we do like, we'll have something like some character actor like HB Warner. Like, I went, oh look, I liked your HB Warner in this movie. Let's watch every movie that HB Warner ever made, right? So we go through these things, right?
I've done that before. Yeah,
I
either
bet you
certain
have.
certain actors or certain directors or certain writers, screenwriters. I follow sometimes,
Hmm.
and so I can't think of all ones, but like I love the Coen brothers, so I've seen everything they've done.
Right, sure,
And I think I've seen everything Hitchcock has done.
sure.
And I can't think, actors, probably more comedians that I've seen everything they've ever done, Jerry Lewis or Bob Hope or,
Yeah,
whatever, fill in the blank,
yeah.
Will and Hardy, whatever, so
Exactly. Well, we call them ironically film festivals,
yeah,
but we
yeah.
pick some really wacky, guy, like, we're having a Stuart Irwin film
Yeah.
festival, right? And like, but you know who Stuart
I
Irwin
do.
is.
I
Like
do. Yeah.
90,000 people don't even know what we just said, right?
Well, he's
But
on the Stu
why
Irwin
not
show.
have a Stuart Irwin film festival?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
we're going to have a what's her name, Maud Eburn Film Festival, and she's
Mhm.
like this, old lady character, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, and it's fun. And IMDb, I contribute pretty heavily to IMDb,
Oh, okay.
writing reviews and also correcting misinformation,
Uh,
which is like
Good
my
luck.
thing, right? Oh, I know, I know. I'm also a compulsive Wikipedia contributor,
Oh, okay.
um, which is just horrific. You
So
know what I
you're the
mean?
plane.
It's just, it's almost like a addiction. It's like confessing. I contribute
Yeah.
to Wikipedia. Hi, my name is Catherine. I contribute to Wikipedia.
Hmm.
And they say, have you gotten help for that? But I I really like doing that, using IMDb to discover these things and then assembling, and then you come up to the one movie that nobody has available. It can't be found at Sinister Cinema or Alpha Video, or not. It's just gone. It's not on Amazon. It's nowhere. And then somebody offers a VHS tape of it for $85.
Right.
Like, do I have to hold up my chronological viewing of every Stu Irwin movie to pay $85 for this one
Yeah.
VHS?
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
you know.
That's one thing I've never understood, about the reissuing of things since you mentioned that. It's like, things, I get it when things came out on videotape. That was basically the first format. I'm not going to count Super 8 or whatever,
Right, right. That's a long time
that
ago.
you could get a complete feature.
Hmm.
And, they probably generally thought, well, we better put out the hits first and then go
Right,
to more obscure things. What's odd to me is when you carry it over to DVD and then Blu-ray and then 4K and whatever's next,
right.
is what makes the cut to go to that next
Okay,
level,
see,
and
now
it's
you're
not always the
talking.
big hit movies.
Yeah, now you're talking about what I was talking about.
Yeah,
In mining engineering, this is called a classifier. The
yeah,
sieve, the sieves with the different degrees of fineness of mesh. It's just called a classifier. They go through the classifier and a new technology or a new layer is added before everything gets through the freaking classifier,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And yeah, I have stuff still on DVD that I cannot find streaming.
yeah,
I have stuff on VHS that I cannot find on DVD, and you're kind of like, oh no, but I want to watch it every 20 years or every 10 years,
yeah.
right? And the same is true for music. Oh my God. I mean, it's just horrifying when you
Mm,
look at some country western or blues musician and they've got, like the 18 greatest songs this guy did. And then what about the other 20? Right?
yeah,
They're not available.
right.
And they are available on 78 RPM records.
Yeah,
But
if you
so
can find them, yeah.
you can find them, right? And you'd think that with digital publication now,
Uh, yeah,
uh, I'm an archivist, and I take and transcribe old newspaper articles about hoodoo, which is African American folk magic, and I have a whole website called southernspirits.org, as opposed to southernspirits.com, which is a liquor store. It really is. But southernspirits.org, I transcribe these, and this is what my patrons pay me for. Every week you get some new historical thing because nobody else ever bothered to transcribe it.
hmm,
And and I do it for very small bucks. I mean, Patreon doesn't pay for much, but just pay for me to do it. But the idea that it's all of if you love something, think about how you can distribute it. It's important.
yeah. Well, we're getting near the end again, so I will.
Okay. Well,
This time
I
I
could
will
try.
wrap it up. But I usually ask one last question: is you know, if you're making any personal appearances, or if you have any new projects. It sounds like you're always working on something, or how people can contact you.
Okay. My husband and I together own about 85 domains. So if you're interested in what we're interested in, you'll find one of those domains.
Very
But
cool.
the biggest domain, which also lists the others, is called luckymojo.com. And at Lucky Mojo, you'll find a forum, which is forum.luckymojo.com, where you can pretty much post, "Hi, cat," and I'll answer you. There's tens of thousands of people participate in it. I'm working right now on a book called Astrology for Root Workers, which is about the history of astrology in African American culture, something which many white people believe did not exist. And I've just become fed up with them and want to shove them to the wall and put my hands around their throat and say,
Ah.
"Fuck you guys." And so it's a whole book about historical astrology by Southern Black root doctors.
Mhm.
And I'm also editing and publishing other books. We do a festival every year called the Virtual Hoodoo Heritage Festival. It's on Zoom. So I'm doing that. I'm not making personal appearances. I'm pretty autistic and never like social things anyway.
Mhm.
And as I've gotten older and COVID made an excuse, I just became crankier and stayed home more.
Fair enough.
And I do have a model railroad in my yard, which Nagashiba and I run together. And the National Garden Railway Association National Convention will be held in Santa Clara this 4th of July weekend, and our layout will be open to the public. So if you like G-scale steam locomotives of the 10-wheeler era, come and see our layout.
Hmm.
There's always something happening in Ironwood land. It's what it. Pick a part of popular culture, and you'll find me working in it, publishing in it, producing in it, enjoying it, buying it. That's what I do.
That's
You can
very
find me
cool.
on Patreon, Catherine Ironwood, and subscribe. And if you subscribe to the high rate, you'll get a box full of all my cast-offs that I'm upgrading.
Very cool. All right. Well, I want to thank you, Kat Ironwood, for being my special guest on today's Fun Ideas podcast.
It's a great
And
title, Fun Ideas.
thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I'm sorry if I talk too long and too
No,
fast.
this is great. And we will see you next time. All right.
All right.
I
All
will
right.
talk to you
Thank you
soon.
so much.
Have a
Bye-bye.
great day. Bye. All right. Are you still there? Oh, that ended the. Okay.